Have you ever felt too late to start something important? Have you ever looked around and thought you wasted too much time, that your chance had passed, that you should have started 10, 20 years ago? Well, get ready to hear the story of a man who began his true mission at 80 years old. No, you didn't read that wrong. 80 years old. An age when most people are thinking about resting, enjoying their grandchildren, telling stories of the past. But this man was just beginning the most impossible mission in ancient history, freeing 2 million slaves from the most powerful empire in the world. We're talking about Moses, the leader who spent 8 decades preparing for 4 decades of glory. And if you think that was wasted time, this story will turn your perspective upside down. The truth is, we live in a culture of haste. Everything needs to be fast, viral, instantaneous. 20-year-old entrepreneurs creating billion-dollar companies, influencers becoming famous overnight, meteoric successes that seem effortless. And when we look back at our own journey with its deserts, its years of anonymity, its failed attempts, we beat our chests and wonder, where did I go wrong? Why is it taking so long for me? But what if I told you that long preparation is not only not a waste, but could be exactly what sets you apart from everyone who skipped steps and imploded along the way? What if the years you think you wasted are actually the foundation that will support the weight of your mission when it finally arrives? Moses was no ordinary man. He would become Judaism's most important prophet, the author of the first 5 books of the Bible, the liberator of an entire nation. But before he was all this, he was a baby, condemned to death, a prince in exile, a fugitive in the desert, an anonymous shepherd for 40 years. His life was divided into 3 perfect acts of 40 years each. 40 years in Pharaoh's palace, learning how empires work, 40 years in the desert, unlearning his arrogance, and 40 years leading the most stubborn people in history through a literal and metaphorical desert. And here lies the paradox that will leave you thinking for days. If God could have used Moses at any time, why wait 80 years? Why not call him at 20, full of energy and ideals? Why not at 40, at the peak of maturity? Why let a man grow old until his hair was gray before giving him the most important mission of his life? The answer will surprise you, because it has everything to do with you, with your current frustration, with the feeling that time is passing and you still haven't reached where you should be. Moses needed 80 years of preparation, because the mission God had for him was too great for such a small preparation. Freeing 2 million people from a millennia-old empire is not a task for someone immature, impulsive, or unprepared. It's not a job for someone who still has something to prove. It's a mission for someone who has already been broken, rebuilt, emptied of themselves, and filled with something much greater. And every decade of those 80 years was necessary. Every experience in the palace, every year in the desert, every sheep he shepherded, every night alone gazing at the stars, every moment he thought his life no longer had a purpose. All of this was building the man who would be able to stand before Pharaoh and say, "Let my people go." So, if you're feeling behind, stay with me on this journey, because in the end, you'll understand that long preparation isn't time wasted. It's time invested, and the difference between the two will completely change how you see your own story. Let's start at the beginning, at a time when Moses shouldn't even have been alive. It was a morning like any other in Egypt, but for Hebrew families, each dawn brought the same terror. Pharaoh had given an order that echoed like a death sentence in every home. Every newborn Hebrew boy was to be thrown into the Nile River. It wasn't just wanton cruelty. It was state policy. The Hebrews had multiplied so much that Egypt began to see them as a threat. So the empire did what empires do when they're afraid. It tried to nip the problem in the bud. And in that context of institutionalized genocide, a Hebrew woman named Jochebed gave birth to a boy. She looked at that baby and knew she couldn't keep him hidden forever. Babies cry, babies make noise, and Egyptian soldiers weren't known for compassion. But she also couldn't simply hand her son over to his death. So she did something desperate, something that blended faith and courage in an incalculable proportion. Jochebed wove a basket from reeds, waterproofed it with bitumen and pitch, placed her baby inside, and placed the basket among the reeds on the banks of the Nile River. Technically, she was obeying Pharaoh's order to place the baby in the river, but she didn't throw it, she positioned it. She left the baby's older sister, Miriam, watching from afar to see what would happen. And what happened next was an irony only history could write. Pharaoh's daughter, the very daughter of the man who ordered the death of all Hebrew babies, went down to the river to bathe. She saw the basket, sent her servants to get it, opened it, and found a crying baby. And here's the detail that changes everything. She knew it was a Hebrew baby. The scriptures make that clear. But instead of complying with her father's order, she decided to adopt him. She named him Moses, which means drawn from the water, and took him to the palace. Miriam, clever as she was, offered a Hebrew wet nurse to care for the baby. And who was the wet nurse? Moses' own mother, Jochebed. So Moses not only survived, but was raised in the palace that slaughtered his people, while his own mother breastfed him and likely told him in his early years who he really was. The irony was brutal and strategic. The boy who should have been dead was being raised with the best education the ancient world could offer. Egypt wasn't just any civilization, it was the superpower of its time. They had gigantic libraries, advanced knowledge of mathematics, astronomy, medicine, architecture, and administration. And Moses had access to all of this. He grew up as an Egyptian prince, grandson of the pharaoh, with private tutors teaching him about war, politics, religion, and the management of empires. While his Hebrew brothers carried bricks under the whip, he learned to command armies. While they mixed clay, he studied the secrets of how Egypt governed millions of people through bureaucracy, hierarchy, and centralized power. And all of this, unbeknownst to anyone, was preparing him for a future mission. Because you don't liberate a people from an empire without understanding how that empire works. You don't overthrow Goliath without knowing its weaknesses. And Moses was receiving the perfect education within the belly of the beast on how to defeat it. Moses' first 40 years were spent in impossible contrast. By day, he was an Egyptian prince, walking the marble corridors of the palace, being served by slaves, learning the ways of power. He saw the pharaoh rule with an iron fist, saw how orders were given and obeyed without question, saw the machinery of the empire working with frightening precision. He participated in religious ceremonies to the Egyptian gods, learned about Ra, the sun god, about Osiris, about the entire pantheon that sustained that civilization's worldview. He studied military tactics because Egyptian princes were trained for war. He learned to read and write in hieroglyphics, mastering the language of the conquerors. Every skill, every lesson, every experience was being stored in his mind, building an arsenal of knowledge that would be essential decades later. But at night, or in his most intimate moments, Moses carried a weight no other Egyptian prince did. He knew who he truly was. His mother, during the years of breastfeeding, likely planted the seed of Hebrew identity in him. He knew the blood coursing through his veins was the same blood as the slaves he saw from afar, and this created an existential tension impossible to ignore. Who was he, after all? Egyptian or Hebrew? Oppressor or oppressed? He had everything a man could want: power, education, comfort, a secure future. But something inside him wouldn't settle, because privilege doesn't buy identity. You can be raised in a palace, but if your soul knows you don't belong there, each day is a lie that builds until it explodes. And in Moses' case, the explosion was coming. At the age of 40, Moses went out to see the Hebrew slaves working. We don't know if it was the first time or if he did it often, but on that particular day, he saw something that tore the veil of his comfortable life. An Egyptian was beating a Hebrew, and something inside Moses snapped. Maybe it was the raw injustice. Maybe it was the identification with his people he could no longer deny. Maybe it was 40 years of internal tension finally finding an outlet. But Moses looked around, saw that no one was around, and killed the Egyptian. Then he hid the body in the sand, as if he could also bury the gravity of what he had done. In that moment, he thought he was doing justice. He thought he was defending his people. He thought perhaps that this was the beginning of something greater, that the Hebrews would see him as a liberator and rise up with him. But the next day, when Moses returned and saw two Hebrews fighting, he tried to intervene. One of them turned to him and said, "Who made you ruler and judge over us? Do you intend to kill me as you killed the Egyptian?" These words were like a punch in the gut. Everyone knew. The secret had leaked. And if the Hebrews knew, Pharaoh would soon know too. Moses realized in that instant that he had made a catastrophic mistake. He had acted impulsively, without a plan, without considering the consequences. He had 40 years of education behind him, but zero knowledge about how to truly liberate a people. His act of violence didn't inspire rebellion. It inspired gossip. The Hebrews didn't see him as a hero. They saw him as a prince pretending to be a savior. And Pharaoh, upon learning of the murder, ordered Moses' death. So the prince of Egypt became a fugitive, running for his life. Moses fled to the Midian desert, a region east of Egypt, across the Red Sea, from prince to refugee, from marble palaces to goatskin tents, from royal banquets to shepherd scraps. The fall was as brutal as it was necessary, because God couldn't use a self-important Moses, confident in his own strength, thinking impulsive violence was the answer. He needed a broken, humble Moses, emptied of arrogance, and the desert specializes in doing that to people. In the desert, you have no audience, no one to impress, no resume to boast. It's just you, the sheep, the silence, and time passing too slowly. Moses sat by a well, exhausted, without direction, without a future. And it was there, at the bottom of the literal and metaphorical well, that his life took another unexpected turn. 7 daughters of a local priest named Jethro came to draw water from the well to water their father's flock. But other shepherds drove them away, because in that macho and violent culture, women were seen as easy prey. Moses, though broken, hadn't lost the sense of justice that led him to kill the Egyptian. Only this time, he used his strength, with control. He defended the women and helped them water their animals. When they returned home earlier than usual, Jethro asked what had happened. They told him about the Egyptian who had defended them. Jethro sent for him, and Moses ended up staying. He married Zipporah, one of Jethro's daughters, and became a shepherd. An Egyptian prince, educated at the finest university in the ancient world, now spent his days caring for dumb animals that would eat anything and needed to be guided to avoid falling off cliffs. The humiliation was complete, but it was exactly what he needed. For 40 years, Moses lived in the anonymity of the desert. 40 years. Think about it. 40 years waking up at dawn, leading sheep to pasture, protecting them from predators, searching for water on dry land, sleeping in the open. 40 years without the spotlight, without recognition, without anyone telling him he was special. Meanwhile, in Egypt, his Hebrew brothers remained slaves, groaning under the lash, crying out for liberation, and Moses wasn't doing anything about it. Or was he? Because the desert teaches things the palace never did. It teaches patience, because you can't rush sheep. It teaches dependence, because you can't survive there alone. It teaches humility, because there's nothing grand about changing a sheep's diaper. And it teaches, above all, that it's not about you. Sheep don't follow you because you're important. They follow because you care for them. And this simple lesson would be the foundation of everything Moses would do later, because leading 2 million people through the desert isn't much different from herding sheep. You need infinite patience, dependence on God, and the awareness that it's not about your glory, it's about the well-being of the flock. The desert also taught Moses to know every stone, every spring of water, every safe route in that region. He didn't know it yet, but he was studying the map for the journey he would make decades later with the people of Israel. Each day spent shepherding was a reconnaissance of the terrain for the future exodus. God wastes nothing. Every experience, every skill, every seemingly lost year was being archived for later use. The 40 years in the palace taught Moses how empires work. The 40 years in the desert taught him how to survive when the empire collapses. And these two educations combined would make him the only man capable of leading a people from within an empire and sustaining them in the middle of the desert for 4 decades. The preparation was complete, but Moses didn't know it. He thought his life was over at 40 when he fled Egypt. He thought he would be a shepherd until he died, until the day he saw something impossible. Moses was 80 years old when everything changed. 80, an age when most people at the time were already dead or close to it. But that day, while tending his father-in-law's flock near Mount Horeb, he saw something that stopped him in his tracks. A bush was on fire, but it wasn't consumed. It wasn't an optical illusion caused by the desert heat. It was real fire on real branches, but the plant wasn't burning. Moses, curious as any human being would be, decided to approach to see it up close. And it was then that he heard a voice that came from within the fire, a voice that knew his name, Moses, Moses. And he, with his heart racing, responded, "Here I am." The voice said, "Do not come any closer. Take off your sandals from your feet, for the place where you stand is holy ground." And then the voice identified itself. "I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob." Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God, but God wasn't finished. He said he had seen the affliction of his people in Egypt, that he had heard their cry because of their oppressors, and that he had come down to free them. And then came the part that would change Moses' life forever. Come now, therefore, and I will send you to Pharaoh, that you may bring my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. Imagine the shock. 80 years. 80 years of life, 40 of them herding sheep in obscurity, and suddenly God appears and says, "Now is your time. Go to Egypt, face the most powerful empire in the world, and free 2 million slaves." Moses could have said, "Finally." He could have jumped for joy, embracing the mission with both arms. But that's not what happened, because 80 years of life also bring 80 years of doubts, fears, and awareness of one's own limitations. Moses' first reaction was, "Who am I to go to Pharaoh and bring the children of Israel out of Egypt?" Note the question, who am I? 40 years ago, he knew who he was. He was a prince. He was confident. He killed an Egyptian thinking he could make a difference, but 40 years in the desert had drained him of any illusions of grandeur. Now, he was just an old shepherd, forgotten, irrelevant, and God responded with the only answer that matters: "I will be with you." It's not about who you are, Moses. It's about who I am. But Moses wasn't convinced. He raised another objection. What if they don't believe me? If they ask what the name of this God who sent you is, what do I say? And God responded with the most mysterious and powerful name in history: "I am who I am." Tell them that I am sent me. Not one God among many, not an impersonal force, but the God who exists by himself, who needs no explanation, who simply is. But Moses still had more excuses. Third objection, I don't know how to speak well. I'm slow of speech and slow of tongue. This could mean he had some kind of speech impediment, or simply that he wasn't a natural orator. Either way, he was saying, "God, you chose the wrong person. Choose someone eloquent, charismatic, who knows how to convince crowds." And God, with infinite patience, replied, "Who made man's mouth? Is it not I? Go, I will be with your mouth and teach you what to say." But Moses still wasn't convinced. Fourth excuse, and this was the one that angered God: "O Lord, send the one you will send." In other words, send someone else, anyone else. I don't want this mission. And then the scriptures say that the Lord's anger burned against Moses. But even so, God didn't give up on him. He said that Aaron, Moses' brother, would be his spokesman. Moses would speak to Aaron, and Aaron would speak to the people and to Pharaoh. 5 excuses, 5 attempts to refuse the mission. And if you've ever felt inadequate for something great God has placed before you, you're not alone. Moses, the greatest liberator in history, tried to refuse 5 times. But here's the truth that changes everything. God wasn't looking for someone qualified. He was looking for someone available. And after 80 years of preparation, breaking Moses' arrogance, emptying him of self-confidence, teaching him dependence, patience, and shepherding, Moses was now ready. Not because he was strong, but because he knew he was weak. Not because he was eloquent, but because he knew he would need help. Not because he was young and energetic, but because he was old and full of wisdom about his own limitations. And that was precisely what made him the right man for the mission. So, after much divine insistence, Moses finally accepted. He took his family, his shepherd staff, and returned to Egypt after 40 years of exile. The return to Egypt must have been surreal. 40 years. Earlier, Moses had fled as a fugitive, with Pharaoh after him. Now he returned, old and weary, but with a divine mission. He encountered Aaron, his brother, who had remained in Egypt all those years. God had spoken to Aaron as well, preparing him to join Moses on this journey. The 2 brothers, reunited after decades, now worked together on an impossible mission. First, they went to the elders of Israel, told them about Moses' encounter with God, and performed the signs God had given Moses as proof: the staff turning into a serpent, the hand becoming leprous and being healed, water turning into blood. The elders believed. The people bowed down and worshipped, because finally, someone had come to free them. But the real challenge wasn't convincing the Hebrews. It was facing Pharaoh. Moses and Aaron went to the palace, the same palace where Moses had grown up decades before. But now another Pharaoh was on the throne, likely a son or grandson of the one Moses had known. They introduced themselves and said, "Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, let my people go, that they may hold a feast to me in the wilderness." Pharaoh's response was exactly what you'd expect from a tyrant. "Who is the Lord?" that I should obey him and let Israel go. I do not know the Lord, nor will I let Israel go." In Pharaoh's mind, he was a god. Egypt had a theology that deified the ruler. So when Moses came to talk about another god, a god he should obey, this wasn't just a political request. It was theological blasphemy. And Pharaoh didn't react well. In fact, he reacted by worsening the Hebrews' situation. He ordered the overseers to stop providing straw for the slaves to make bricks, but demanded the same production quota. Now the Hebrews would have to find their own straw and still produce the same amount of bricks. The result was predictable. They failed, were beaten, and returned furious against Moses and Aaron. They said, "May the Lord judge you, because you have made our case." Disgusting before Pharaoh and his servants, giving them the sword in their hand to kill us. Moses, discouraged, returned to God and practically vented, "Lord, why have you mistreated this people? Why did you send me? Ever since I came to Pharaoh to speak in your name, he has mistreated this people, and you have not at all delivered your people." It was the beginning of a pattern that would repeat itself over the next 40 years. Moses being squeezed between a God who gave orders and a people who complained. But God wasn't finished. He told Moses that now Pharaoh would see what he would do, and so began one of the most epic narratives in ancient history, the 10 plagues of Egypt. These weren't random plagues. Each was a direct attack on a specific Egyptian god. Egypt had a complex polytheistic religion with gods for everything: the river, the sun, fertility, animals, life, and death. And God was going to dismantle this entire pantheon, one god at a time, showing that none of them had real power. The first plague was the transformation of the Nile's water into blood. The Nile was sacred, considered a source of life associated with the god Hapi. When Moses stretched his staff over the waters and they turned to blood, it wasn't just an ecological disaster, it was a theological declaration. Their river god has no power whatsoever. The second plague was frogs invading all of Egypt. Houses, beds, ovens, everything was infested with frogs. The goddess Heket, associated with frogs and fertility, was ridiculed. The third plague was lice, a direct attack on the ritual cleanliness that the Egyptians so valued. Pharaoh's magicians, who had managed to imitate the first 2 plagues using trickery, were unable to produce lice. They said, "This is the finger of God." But Pharaoh hardened his heart. The fourth plague was swarms of flies, but only in the Egyptian region. In the land of Goshen, where the Hebrews lived, there were no flies. God was making a distinction between his people and the Egyptians. The fifth plague was a pestilence that killed all Egyptian livestock, but none of the Hebrew cattle, another blow to the gods associated with animals, such as Apis, the sacred ox. The sixth plague was painful boils that appeared on the Egyptians and their surviving livestock. The magicians, who until then had at least tried to compete with Moses, now couldn't even stand before Pharaoh because of the boils. The seventh plague was hail of a size and intensity never seen before, mixed with fire, destroying crops and killing anyone outside. The eighth plague was locusts that ate what was left of the vegetation after the hail. The ninth plague was darkness that could be felt, total darkness for 3 days. This was perhaps the most theologically offensive plague because it attacked Ra, the sun god, the most important deity in the Egyptian pantheon. If Ra couldn't prevent 3 days of total darkness, what was the point of worshiping him? And yet, Pharaoh wouldn't let the people go. His heart was hard as stone. Then came the 10th and final plague, the most terrible of all. God told Moses that he would pass through the land of Egypt at midnight, and that every firstborn Egyptian would die, from the firstborn of Pharaoh to the firstborn of a slave, and every firstborn of livestock. But the Hebrews would be spared if they followed specific instructions. Each family was to sacrifice an unblemished lamb, smear its blood on the doorposts and lintels of their homes, and eat the roasted meat that same night with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. They were to eat hastily, with their loins girded, sandals on their feet, and staff in their hands, ready to go. This would be the Passover, the night God would pass over the blood-marked houses and spare the firstborn within them. The lamb would replace the son. It was a powerful prophetic image that pointed to Jesus Christ thousands of years later, the Lamb of God who would be sacrificed to spare humanity from spiritual death. At midnight, exactly as God had said, it happened. There was a great cry in Egypt, for there was not a house where someone was not dead. From Pharaoh's palace to the lowest dungeon, Every firstborn Egyptian died that night. The prince, heir to the throne, dead. The jailer's son, dead. The firstborn calf of the herd, dead. It was a divine judgment of a magnitude Egypt had never experienced. And in the Hebrew homes, marked with lamb's blood, everyone slept. Safely. The angel of death literally passed over them. The contrast was impossible to ignore. Obedience to God's word meant life. Disobedience meant death. And there was no middle ground. Pharaoh, who had lost his own son that night, called Moses and Aaron before dawn. His voice no longer held its former arrogance. It was the voice of a broken, defeated, desperate man. He said, "Arise, get out from among my people, both you and the children of Israel. Go, serve the Lord, as you have said. Also, take your flocks and your herds with you, as you have said. Go and bless me also." The Egyptians, terrified, pressured the Hebrews to leave quickly, giving them silver, gold, and clothing, anything to make them leave quickly. And so, after 430 years of slavery, 2 million people left Egypt in a single night. They left so quickly that they didn't have time to let their bread rise, so they ate unleavened bread. They left carrying the bones of Joseph, who before his death had made the children of Israel swear to take him back to the promised land. They left not as shamefaced fugitives, but as a triumphant army, carrying with them the riches of Egypt. Moses, at 80 years old, was finally fulfilling the mission for which he had been prepared for 8 decades. And in the early days, everything seemed to be working. God went before them in a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night, guiding the way. They marched east, toward the Red Sea. But then, something changed. God instructed Moses to have the people camp facing the sea, in a position that seemed strategically foolish. They were trapped, with the sea in front and the desert on either side. And that was exactly where Pharaoh, who had regretted letting them go, saw his opportunity. He mobilized 600 chariots, chose his best warriors, and set out in pursuit. When the Israelites saw the Egyptian army approaching, their chariots gleaming in the sun and their spears pointed at them, panic was instantaneous. They cried out to Moses with bitter sarcasm, "Were there no graves in Egypt to take us out of there so that we would die in this wilderness? Why have you done this to us, taking us out of Egypt? Isn't this what we said to you in Egypt? Let us alone that we may serve the Egyptians? It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness." This was the first time, but not the last, that the people would turn against Moses in his time of trouble. And Moses, with the patience he had cultivated over 40 years of tending sheep, replied, "Do not be afraid. Stand still and see the salvation the Lord will accomplish for you today. For you will never see the Egyptians whom you have seen today again. The Lord will fight for you, and you will keep silent." He didn't promise that they would fight. He promised that God would fight. And then came the divine order. Lift up your staff, stretch out your hand over the sea and divide it, so that the children of Israel may pass through the midst of the sea on dry ground. Moses obeyed. He stretched out his staff over the Red Sea, and God sent a strong east wind blowing all that night, dividing the waters. It wasn't a superficial division. Scripture says the waters stood like a wall to their right and left, and the seabed became dry. Geologists and archaeologists debate to this day which part of the Red Sea was crossed and how it happened, but the text is clear. It was a miracle that defied natural laws. 2 million people with their sheep, cattle, children, and elderly crossed a corridor in the middle of the sea during the night. 14 kilometers of crossing with walls of water on either side, held together by divine power. Imagine the scene. Children looking up and seeing fish swimming within the walls of water. Adults running with their belongings, animals being led along the impossible path, and Moses leading the entire multitude through what should have been a watery tomb, but had become a highway to freedom. The Egyptians, stubborn to the end, followed them into the sea. 600 chariots, cavalry, and infantry, all confident they could reach and massacre the Hebrews before they completed the crossing. But God upset the Egyptians in the middle of the sea, causing the chariot wheels to come off, making the pursuit difficult and slow. The Egyptians realized too late that they were fighting God himself and tried to flee back to shore, but it was too late. Moses, now on the other side, stretched out his hand over the sea again, and the waters returned with full force, covering the chariots, the horsemen, and the entire Pharaoh's army that had entered the sea behind them. None of them survived. The Israelites on the other side saw the bodies of the Egyptians being thrown by the waves onto the shore. The mightiest army in the world had been swallowed by the sea, and the people feared the Lord and believed in him and in Moses, his servant. That day, Moses and his sister Miriam led the people in a victory song. It was a moment of pure euphoria, of celebration, of vibrant faith. But if you know the story, you know that this faith didn't last long. 3 days later, when they found no water and only bitter water at Marah, the people were already murmuring against Moses. God showed Moses a tree that, thrown into the water, made it sweet, but it was a pattern that would repeat itself ad nauseum. Hardship, murmuring, a miracle from God, temporary peace, new hardship, murmuring again. Leading 2 million people through the desert proved to be exactly what Moses must have imagined it would be. Exhausting, thankless, and endlessly challenging. But it was what he had been prepared for. A month and a half after leaving Egypt, the food they had brought was running out, and the people, with short memories, began to say they would have been better off staying in Egypt, where at least they had pots of meat and bread in abundance. They conveniently forgot that they were slaves being whipped. They forgot that their children were being killed. In the selective memory of dissatisfaction, Egypt had become a paradise. Moses took his complaint to God, and God responded with manna. Every morning except the Sabbath, the ground was covered with a white substance, similar to coriander seed, that tasted like honey cake. They were to gather only enough for one day, because if they saved it for the next day, it would breed vermin and smell bad. It was a daily lesson in trust. God will provide tomorrow too, don't hoard. And for 40 years, without a single day missing, the manna fell. But daily manna became sickening. The people craved meat. So God sent quail in such abundance that it covered the camp. The people ate until they were literally sick. And yet, they continued to complain. They complained about the lack of water, and God told Moses to strike a rock, from which came enough water for 2 million people and all their animals. They complained about Moses, saying he was a dictator who had led them into the desert to die. They complained about God, questioning why he had brought them out of Egypt. It was a vicious cycle of ingratitude that tested Moses' patience every day. And if you've ever led anything, you know how frustrating it is to work for people who only know how to complain. Moses was experiencing this on a national scale. 3 months after leaving Egypt, they reached Mount Sinai. And there, God called Moses to climb the mountain. For 40 days and 40 nights, Moses stood on top of the mountain in God's presence, receiving the 10 Commandments and all the laws that would govern Israel. The mountain smoked, thundered, and flashed lightning. The people saw it from afar and were afraid. But Moses climbed and entered the cloud where God was. And God wrote with his own finger on tablets of stone the fundamental commandments that would become the moral foundation not only of Israel, but of all Western civilization. You shall have no other gods. You shall not make any carved image. You shall not take God's name in vain. Remember the Sabbath day. Honor your father and your mother. You shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not bear false witness. You shall not covet. These were simple rules, but revolutionary for that time. They took power out of the hands of kings and priests and placed it in the hands of a God who cared about justice, not empty rituals. But while Moses was on the mountain receiving God's laws, the people below were doing the exact opposite of the first commandment. They pressured Aaron, saying that Moses had taken too long, that he was probably dead, and that they needed gods to guide them. Aaron, weak under pressure, asked them to bring all the gold they had. He melted it all down and made a golden calf, and the people bowed down before it, saying, "Behold your God, O Israel, who brought you out of the land of Egypt." They held a feast, ate, drank, and indulged in carnal pleasures. 40 days. That's how long it took for a people who had seen 10 plagues, crossed the Red Sea on foot, and eaten manna from heaven to turn to a metal idol. Human nature is brutal like that. We forget God at the first sign of difficulty and bow down to anything that gives us immediate comfort. God told Moses what was happening and wanted to destroy the entire people, promising to make Moses a new, great nation. But Moses interceded. He argued with God, asked for mercy, and remembered the promises made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And God repented of the evil he had promised to do. Moses came down from the mountain with the 2 tablets of the law in his hands, tablets written by the very finger of God. But when he approached the camp and saw the golden calf, saw the people dancing, and heard the profane music, something inside him broke. His rage was so intense that he threw the tablets to the ground, and they shattered at the foot of the mountain. He took the golden calf, burned it in the fire, ground it to powder, sprinkled the powder on the water, and made the people drink it. It was a deliberate humiliation. You want to worship this? Then eat it. Afterward, Moses summoned the Levites who sided with God and ordered them to execute the leaders of the rebellion. 3,000 men died that day. It was brutal justice, but necessary to establish that God was not a deity who could be ignored or replaced by idols. And then Moses went up the mountain again and asked forgiveness for the people. He told God that if he did not forgive Israel, he would erase his name, Moses, from the book of life as well. It was an intercession of sacrificial love, the kind of leadership that puts the good of the people above one's own salvation. God forgave, but said the consequences would remain. And Moses had to make new tablets on which God would rewrite the commandments. The law would remain, but the people's betrayal would be marked in history. The rest of the time at Sinai was devoted to building the tabernacle, a portable tent where God would dwell among the people. Moses received detailed instructions regarding every material, every measurement, every sacred object. The Ark of the Covenant, where the tablets of the law would be kept, covered with pure gold, with 2 golden cherubim on its corners. The bronze altar where sacrifices would be offered. The golden 7-branched lampstand. The table of showbread. The altar of incense. The curtains, the pillars, the bases. Everything had meaning. Everything pointed to profound spiritual truths. And when the tabernacle was finished, the glory of God descended upon it so that not even Moses could enter. The cloud covered the tabernacle by day and fire by night. And when the cloud lifted, the people knew it was time to move on. When the cloud lifted, they camped. God was literally leading the journey, but the journey itself was long and painful. After leaving Sinai, the Israelites walked toward the land of Canaan, the promised land. It took them only a short time to reach the border. If all had gone well, they could have entered the land within 2 years of leaving Egypt. But when they arrived at Kadesh Barnea on the border of Canaan, Moses sent 12 spies, 1 leader from each tribe, to explore the land, see what the people were like, whether the cities were fortified, and whether the land was fertile. The spies spent 40 days exploring, and when they returned, they brought back a cluster of grapes so large that 2 men had to carry it on a pole. They brought back pomegranates and figs. The land truly flowed with milk and honey, fertile beyond imagination. But 10 of the 12 spies brought back a negative report. They said, "The land is good, but the people who live in it are strong. The cities are fortified and very large. We saw giants there, sons of Anak, and we were like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and so we were in theirs." It was a report based on fear, not faith. But 2 spies, Joshua and Caleb, completely disagreed. Caleb stood up in the midst of the crowd and said, "Come, let us go up and possess it, for we will surely prevail against it." But the other 10 spies reinforced the fear, saying it would be suicide to try to conquer the land. And the people, instead of trusting God, who had performed so many miracles for them, believed the negative report. They began to weep, to complain, to talk about choosing a new leader and returning to Egypt. It was the most absurd rebellion possible. After all God had done, they wanted to return to slavery. Moses and Aaron prostrated themselves before the entire congregation. Joshua and Caleb tore their clothes in despair and tried to convince the people, "The land we went to explore is an exceedingly good land. If the Lord delights in us, he will bring us into that land and give it to us, a land flowing with milk and honey. Only do not rebel against the Lord, and do not fear the people of the land, for they are our bread. Their protection has been removed from them, and the Lord is with us. Do not be afraid of them." But the people were so enraged that they began to talk of stoning Joshua and Caleb. That was when the glory of the Lord appeared in the tabernacle, and God told Moses that he would destroy the entire people and make of Moses a greater and stronger nation. Once again, Moses interceded, and once again, God forgave. But the consequences were severe. God declared that none of those 20 years old or older who had seen all the miracles and still did not trust in him would enter the promised land. They wandered in the wilderness until everyone in that generation died. The only ones who would enter would be Joshua and Caleb, the 2 faithful spies, and the new generation that would grow up in the wilderness. And since the spies had spent 40 days exploring the land, the people would wander for 40 years. In the wilderness, a year for each day. It was a bitter but just sentence, and it meant that Moses, already 80 years old, would spend the rest of his life leading a people doomed to wander, knowing that he himself would never enter the land he so longed to see. These 40 years were a mixture of miracles and constant rebellion. The people rebelled against Moses several times. Korah, Dathan, and Abiram led a rebellion, questioning the authority of Moses and Aaron, claiming that the entire congregation was holy and that they had no right to elevate themselves above others. Moses, tired of the accusations, said that God would show whom he had chosen. The next day, the earth opened and swallowed Korah, Dathan, Abiram, and all who were with them. They descended alive into Sheol. The earth closed over them, and they perished from among the congregation. 250 men offering incense were also consumed by fire. It was a dramatic divine judgment that showed that God tolerates no challenge to the leadership he has established. But the next day, incredibly, the people murmured again, accusing Moses and Aaron of killing the rebels. God's anger flared, and a plague began to kill the people. Moses ordered Aaron to take the censer, put fire from the altar and incense in it, and run among the people to make atonement. Aaron ran and stood between the dead and the living, and the plague stopped. But 14,700 had already died. It was a brutal lesson. Rebellion against God has fatal consequences. And yet, the people didn't learn. They complained about everything. Moses, Aaron, the food, the water, the manna, the desert, God. It was like herding extremely stubborn sheep that insisted on running toward a cliff. Moses also made a crucial mistake that would cost him entry into the promised land. At one point, the people were complaining about the lack of water again. God told Moses to speak to the rock, and it would give water. But Moses, already at the end of his patience after decades of enduring complaints, became furious. He gathered the people before the rock and said, "Hear now, you rebels. Shall we bring you water out of this rock?" And then, instead of speaking to the rock as God had commanded, he struck the rock twice with his staff. Water came out abundantly, and the people and livestock drank. But God said to Moses and Aaron, "Because you did not believe me enough to sanctify me in the eyes of the children of Israel, you shall not bring this congregation into the land I have given them." It was a devastating sentence. Moses had led those people for decades. He had interceded for them countless times. He had endured complaining, rebellion, ingratitude. And now, because of a moment of anger, a moment when he acted on impulse rather than following God's precise instructions, he would not enter the promised land. It may seem unfair, but the lesson was clear. Leaders are held to a higher standard. When you represent God before the people, your obedience must be exact. And that moment of disobedience was the result of something deeper. Moses had appropriated the glory. "Shall we bring you water out of this rock?" It wasn't Moses who would provide water, it was God. But in frustration, Moses spoke as if he and Aaron were responsible for the miracle. And God doesn't share his glory with anyone. The years continued to pass. Aaron died on Mount Hor, and Moses stripped him of his priestly garments and placed them on Eleazar, Aaron's son, who assumed the priesthood. Miriam, Moses' sister, also died. The rebellious generation slowly died in the desert, just as God had promised. And a new generation grew up, a generation that had never known Egypt, that had been born or raised in the desert, that had seen God's miracles throughout their lives. This generation would be different. It would be the one that would enter the promised land. And when the time finally came, after 40 years of wandering, the people of Israel were camped on the plains of Moab, across the Jordan, looking toward Jericho. The land was there, before them. But Moses would not enter. God called Moses to climb Mount Nebo, the top of Pisgah. Moses was 120 years old at the time. Scripture says his eyes did not grow dim, nor did he lose his vigor. He was still strong, still capable, but his mission was ending. From the top of that mountain, God showed Moses the entire promised land. Gilead, as far as Dan, all the land of Naphtali, the land of Ephraim and Manasseh, all the land of Judah as far as the western sea, the Negev, and the plain of the valley of Jericho, the city of palm trees, as far as Zoar. God said, "This is the land I swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob, saying, I will give it to your descendants. I have shown you the site of it, but you shall not pass over." Imagine what Moses felt at that moment. He could see the land. It was so close, but he could not enter. Moses died there, on Mount Nebo in the land of Moab, according to the word of the Lord. and God himself buried him in a valley, but to this day, no one knows where his tomb is. The children of Israel mourned him for 30 days, and the scriptures conclude the book of Deuteronomy, the last of the 5 books written by Moses, with these words: "There arose no prophet in Israel since like Moses, with whom the Lord knew face to face, concerning all the signs and wonders he did at the command of the Lord in the land of Egypt, in the sight of Pharaoh and all his officials, and in all his land, and concerning all the mighty works and all the great deeds that Moses performed in the sight of all Israel." It was the end of the journey of a man who changed history forever. But what is Moses' real legacy? It's not just that he freed 2 million slaves, although that alone was extraordinary. It's not just that he wrote the first 5 books of the Bible, laying the theological and legal foundations for the entire Judeo-Christian civilization. It's not just that he brought the 10 Commandments, which to this day govern the morality of billions of people. Moses' legacy goes deeper than all that. It is a living demonstration that God wastes nothing. 80 years of preparation were not time wasted. They were time invested. The 40 years in the palace taught Moses how empires work, how power is wielded, how complex systems are managed. The 40 years in the desert taught him humility, patience, dependence on God, and how to guide a flock through arid land. And those 80 years combined made him the only man capable of doing what needed to be done in the next 40 years. But there's one detail that can't be ignored. The same preparation that equipped him was nearly ruined by a moment of emotional incompetence. 80 years of preparation, decades of faithful leadership, countless intercessions for the people, and a single moment of anger cost Moses entry into the Promised Land. This isn't divine cruelty. It's a lesson in the importance of self-control. You can have all the preparation in the world, all the skills, all the experience, but if you don't know how to control your emotions in critical moments, you can lose what you've worked your entire life for. Moses struck the rock when he should have spoken to it. It seems like a small detail, but it revealed something bigger. In the heat of frustration, he disobeyed God and appropriated the glory that belonged to God alone, and it came at a cost. This story teaches us that long preparation is necessary but not sufficient. You also need patient execution, consistent obedience, and emotional control even in the most stressful moments. Moses did almost everything right. Almost. But that almost cost him dearly. And if that sounds harsh, perhaps it's because we live in a culture that romanticizes talent and undervalues character. We think that if we're good at what we do, we can be careless about how we do it. But God doesn't work that way. For him, the how matters as much as the what. And a leader who can't control their emotions, who acts on impulse, who takes the glory for themselves, is not a leader God can fully use, no matter how prepared they are. So what do you do with this? How do you apply Moses' story to your own life? First, stop thinking you're behind. If Moses started at 80, you're not behind. You're being prepared. Every experience, every desert, every moment of anonymity, every skill you acquired in contexts that seem to have nothing to do with your ultimate purpose, all of it is being archived. God wastes nothing. The years you spent in a job you hated taught you about resilience and how not to lead. The failed relationships taught you about yourself and what you truly need. Failures drained you of arrogance and filled you with dependence. You didn't waste time. You invested time, even without realizing it. Second, recognize that God often prepares us in 2 opposing phases. Moses had the palace and the desert. The palace gave him knowledge, the desert gave him humility, and he needed both. If you only have knowledge without humility, you will implode. If you only have humility without knowledge, you will not be able to perform when the opportunity arises. So, if you are going through a phase that seems the opposite of what you experienced before, don't resist. Embrace it. If you lived years of visibility and now find yourself in anonymity, learn the lessons of the desert. If you lived years of anonymity and now doors are opening, use the knowledge you acquired, but don't lose the humility the desert gave you. The 2 phases work together to shape you. Third, accept that your desert may last a long time. 40 years is a long time, an entire generation. If you're in your 3rd year of the desert and already desperate, take a deep breath. You may have another 37 years ahead of you. Your preparation may be long because your mission is great. Don't compare your process to anyone else's. Each person has a different preparation time, calibrated precisely to the size of the mission God has for them. And the greater the mission, the deeper the preparation needs to be. It's not punishment, it's divine wisdom. God won't put you to lead 2 million people if you only have the patience to lead 10. He won't give you the responsibility of an empire if you've only learned how to manage a tent. So, if the desert is lasting, it's because what comes next is too big for such a small preparation. Fourth, understand that people's complaints will never stop. Moses performed absurd miracles, and the people were still complaining 3 days later. He brought them out of slavery, and they wanted to return. He gave them manna from heaven, and they got sick of it. He brought water from the rock, and they murmured again. If you're waiting for a moment when everyone will applaud you and stop criticizing, give up that illusion. Now, it won't happen. People are naturally ungrateful, especially when they're going through hardship. Your job isn't to make everyone happy. Your job is to obey God and lead in the direction He's shown you, even when people are screaming that you're wrong. Moses did this for 40 years. You can do it for as long as God gives you. Fifth, and perhaps most importantly, control your emotions in critical moments. Moses lost his entrance to the promised land because of a moment of anger. One moment. 80 years of preparation, 40 years of faithful leadership, and one moment of loss of control cost everything. This doesn't mean you have to be perfect. No one is. But it does mean you need to constantly work on your character, especially in areas where you know you're weak. If you have a problem with anger, work on it. If you have a problem with pride, work on it. If you have a problem with impulsivity, work on it. Because in critical moments, when the pressure is at its highest, you won't act based on who you want to be, but on who you truly are. And if you haven't worked on your character during preparation, it will explode during execution. Moses' life also teaches us something about late callings. We live in a culture obsessed with youth, with prodigies, with people who explode early. But some of the most important callings in history came late in life. Moses at 80, Abraham at 75, Noah at 500. Colonel Sanders founded KFC at 65. Laura Ingalls. Wilder published her first book at 64. Vera Wang became fashionable at 40. Writer Mary Wesley published her first novel at 70. Julia Child released her first cookbook at 50. If you feel like you're past your prime, that you missed your chance, that you should have started 20 years ago, you're looking at things the wrong way. God doesn't care about chronological age. He cares about spiritual maturity. And sometimes, that maturity only comes with decades of life lived. Mistakes made, pride broken, and dependency learned. Another thing the story of Moses reveals is that great leaders rarely see the full fruit of their labor. Moses didn't enter the promised land. He saw it from afar, but he didn't set foot in it. And that hurts. There's no romanticizing it. But his legacy wasn't diminished by that. He fulfilled his part. He freed the people, gave them the law, led them through the wilderness, prepared them for conquest. And then he passed the baton to Joshua, who would finish the work. Sometimes your role is to start something that others will finish. Sometimes you plant trees whose shade you'll never enjoy. And that's okay, because the kingdom of God isn't about you achieving personal glory. It's about generations being blessed because of someone's obedience decades ago. And there is something deeply comforting in knowing that Moses, even though he did not enter the promised land, was not forgotten by God. More than 1,000 years later, on the Mount of Transfiguration, when Jesus was transfigured before Peter, James, and John who appeared beside him, Moses and Elijah. Moses finally set foot in the promised land, not as the leader of Israel, but as a witness to the glory of Jesus, the true liberator. What was denied him in life was granted in glory. God never forgets the sacrifices of those who faithfully served him. It may take time. It may not be in this life, but the reward comes. It always comes. And when it comes, it makes up for all the waiting, all the desert, all the long preparation. The story of Moses is also a prophetic shadow of Jesus Christ. Moses freed Israel from physical slavery in Egypt. Jesus freed humanity from the spiritual slavery of sin. Moses instituted the Passover with lamb's blood on the gates. Jesus became the Passover lamb, whose blood marks those who will be saved from eternal death. Moses gave the law on Mount Sinai. Jesus fulfilled the law and gave the Sermon on the Mount, revealing the heart behind the commandments. Moses lifted up a bronze serpent in the desert to heal whoever looked at it. Jesus was lifted up on a cross so that whoever looks to him in faith may be saved. Moses brought manna from heaven to nourish the body. Jesus declared himself the living bread that came down from heaven to nourish the soul. Moses brought water from the rock to quench physical thirst. Jesus offered living water that becomes a spring springing up to eternal life. Every detail of Moses' life pointed to something greater that would come later, and that something greater was Jesus. But returning to us, to our ordinary lives, far from epic miracles and missions to liberate entire nations, what do we take away from this story? We take away that preparation matters, that patience matters, that 80 years isn't too much if it's necessary to mold you into what you need to be. We take away that your deserts aren't accidents, they're resumes, that your failures aren't the end, they're lessons, that your anonymity isn't punishment, it's protection until you're ready. We take away that God sees what no one else sees, uses what no one else would use, and calls what no one else would call. He took a baby condemned to death and made him a prince. He took a fugitive prince and made him a shepherd. He took an 80-year-old shepherd and made him the liberator of a nation. Nothing in your story is wasted in God's hands. And if you're frustrated because you feel like you should have gotten where you want to be by now, because you look around and see younger people achieving what you haven't yet, because the years are passing and you seem to be stuck in the same place, listen carefully. You're not behind. You're being prepared. And long preparation isn't a sign that God has forgotten you. It's a sign that He's investing heavily in you. Because the greater the mission, the longer the preparation. Diamonds don't form overnight. They require extreme pressure for a long time. And when they finally emerge, their value is proportional to the time and pressure they endured. You're not being forgotten. You're being polished. Think about how many times Moses must have questioned his own story. 40 years in the palace, being prepared for something, and then he commits murder and has to flee. He must have thought, I wasted it all. 40 years in the desert, tending sheep, while his brothers groaned in slavery in Egypt. He must have thought, my life has no purpose. And then at 80, when any hope of making a difference seemed to have evaporated, God appears in a burning bush and says, now is your time. It all makes sense retroactively. The 40 years in the palace, necessary. The 40 years in the desert, necessary. The murder that made him flee, horrible, but used by God to lead him to the desert where he would be molded. Nothing was wasted. Everything was preparation, and you only see this by looking back, not forward. So, if you're in the middle of your story and nothing makes sense yet, be patient. Keep walking. Keep obeying. Keep learning. Keep letting yourself be shaped. Because one day, when you look back, you'll see that every piece of the puzzle had a place. Every desert taught you something you'd need later. Every closed door protected you from a path that would destroy you. Every delay was actually a time of maturation you didn't know you needed. And when your burning bush, your moment of calling, finally arrives, you'll understand why it took so long. Because the mission is too big for a small preparation, and God loves you too much to put you through something you're not ready to endure. Moses' life teaches us that success isn't about speed, it's about faithfulness. It's not about arriving quickly, it's about arriving prepared. It's not about impressing others, it's about obeying God. And sometimes obeying God means spending 80 years preparing for 40 years of mission. Does it seem disproportionate? It does. But when you understand the weight of the mission, when you see that Moses wasn't just freeing people, but laying the theological, legal, and moral foundations of a nation that would influence all of human history, you realize that 80 years wasn't too much. It was exactly what was needed. And the same applies to you. The time you're waiting isn't too much. It's exactly what's needed for you to be ready for what God has for you. But also remember the bitter lesson. Control your emotions. Work on your character. Don't let decades of preparation be ruined by a moment of loss of control. Moses almost did everything perfectly. Almost. But that one almost cost him entry to the promised land. And this reminds us that in the kingdom of God, partial obedience is not obedience. Striking the rock when God told you to speak is not acceptable variation. It's disobedience, and it has consequences. So, while you're being prepared, work not only on your skills, but on your character. Not only on your knowledge, but on your self-control. Not only on your competence, but on your humility. Because when the time comes, when the pressure mounts, when people are complaining and you're at your limit, what will come out of you won't be what you want to come out, but what's really inside. And if what's inside is unprocessed anger, unbroken pride, unchecked impulsiveness, it will explode at the worst possible moment. The story of Moses is also a reminder that leadership is loneliness. He climbed the mountain alone to find God. He came down alone carrying the tablets of the law. He interceded alone when God wanted to destroy the people. He died alone on Mount Nebo. Leadership always has a component of loneliness because you see things others don't, carry burdens others don't, make decisions others don't understand. And if you're feeling this loneliness now, know that you're in good company. Moses felt it. Jesus felt it. Every leader God used to accomplish something significant felt it. It's not a sign you're doing something wrong. It's a sign you're doing something important. Important things rarely come with applauding crowds. They come with you, God, and the weight of the mission. And in closing, let me ask you some provocative questions. Are you willing to wait 80 years if that's what God requires of you? Or will you give up in year 5 because you didn't see quick results? Are you willing to be broken in the desert, to have your arrogance deflated, your pride crushed, your illusions shattered? Or do you want shortcuts that leave you intact but also immature? Are you willing to lead ungrateful people who will complain about you even when you're doing your best for them? Or do you need constant applause to keep going? Are you willing to never see the full fruit of your labor, to die before entering the promised land, knowing that others will reap what you sow? Or do you need immediate gratification to feel validated? These aren't comfortable questions, but they are necessary. Because Moses' life wasn't comfortable, it was meaningful. And there's a huge difference between the two. If you've made it this far, it's because something in this story resonated with you. Maybe you're in your desert right now, herding metaphorical sheep, feeling like your life has no purpose, that you've wasted too much time, that it's too late to start. It's not. Maybe you're in your 40s in the palace, accumulating knowledge and skills, but feeling like something isn't right, that you don't belong there, that there's a deeper identity you need to discover. Find out. Maybe you're literally 80 years old and think your life is over, that you have nothing left to contribute. You do. God hasn't retired from using old people. He actually prefers them because they have something young people don't. Wisdom gained through decades of life. Whatever your stage, understand this. God wastes nothing. Every year, every experience, every desert, every closed door, everything is being used to prepare you for something. So what will you do with this information? Will you continue to complain about the time you wasted, or will you start to see these years as an investment? Will you continue to rush, trying to force doors, skipping steps, or will you trust in God's timing, even when it seems too slow? Will you work only on your skills, or will you also work on your character, knowing that a moment of loss of control can cost decades of preparation? Will you give up in the middle of the desert, or will you keep walking, trusting that there's a promised land on the other side, even if you can't see it yet? These are the choices that define whether your life will be a waste or a masterpiece. And the difference isn't speed, it's fidelity. It's not how long it takes, it's how you use the time while you wait. Moses spent 80 years preparing for 40 years of glory, and those 40 years changed history forever. He didn't enter the promised land, but his legacy did. The law he brought still governs. The books he wrote are still read. The God he revealed is still worshipped. And 3,500 years later, we're still talking about him. Because long preparation isn't time wasted, it's time invested. It's a foundation being built, its roots being deepened. And when the time finally comes for the tree to grow, it won't fall at the first wind, because the roots are deep. So be patient with your process. Embrace your desert. Learn your lessons. Work on your character. Control your emotions. And when your burning bush appears, when God calls you to the impossible, you will be ready. Not because you're perfect, but because you were prepared. And this preparation, however long it may be, will make all the difference. Now tell me, has this story changed anything in you? Can you see your years of waiting with new eyes? Are you willing to trust that God knows what he's doing, even when it seems he's taking too long? If so, leave a comment below telling us which phase of Moses' life most connects with the moment you're living now. Are you in the palace, learning but feeling like you don't belong? Are you in the desert, being broken and molded? Or are you before the burning bush, being called to something impossible and full of excuses? Share your story, because it might inspire someone going through the same thing. And if this content helped you in any way, if it made you see your own journey with more hope, do 2 things for me. First, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell, because every week we bring you real stories of people who changed the world. Stories that make you realize that you too can make a difference, no matter your age, your background, or how much time you think you've wasted. And second, share this video with someone who needs to hear that they're not behind, that they're being prepared, It could be that friend who's discouraged, that family member who feels like life has passed them by, that colleague who's frustrated because things haven't happened as they expected. Send it to them, because sometimes the story of Moses is exactly what someone needs to hear to not give up in the middle of the desert. Remember, 80 years of preparation weren't wasted time. They were invested time. And your years aren't wasted either. They're an investment. God is working even when you can't see it. He's shaping you, even when it hurts. He's preparing you, even when it seems like nothing is happening. So take a deep breath, trust the process, and keep walking. Because your burning bush is coming. Your Red Sea will part. Your promised land exists. And when you finally get there, when you look back and see the entire journey, you'll understand why it took so long. Because the mission was too big for a small preparation. And you are too important for God to put you in something you're not ready for. So keep going. Your time is coming. And when it does, 80 years of waiting will make perfect sense. Words from someone who knows the story of Moses and knows that God never ever wastes anything.